Even though Doom is my all-time favourite id game, I have to concede and say that 1996 was the golden age of id Software with the release of Quake. This game felt like the end of a 5-year journey for id Software, as they perfected the art of making a first-person action experience. Wolfenstein was texture mapped, Doom was Wolfenstein times a million, but Quake was a fully 3D game. Gone were the sprites and flat 2D textures of old, and they were replaced with polygons. Quake blew past the competition at the time and was in a league of its own, at least from a technological perspective. id Software was on the top of the world at this time, and Quake was their golden child alongside Doom. The game also exploded onto the multiplayer scene and was one of the first real examples of a huge online experience. Quake had everything going for it, and that's not even counting the impact that the Quake engine had on the gaming landscape. In the many FPS games that came afterwards, they all still had traces of Quake's identity embedded, which is ironic, since Quake was born out of an internal struggle at id Software. Most Quake fans know that the game was being thought of during the Commander Keen days, and was originally going to be an action RPG of sorts. However, Quake wound up just being a continuation of what Doom built up with the FPS genre, and was a mess of cultist, fantasy, tech-based, and Lovecraftian elements. Ever since that first game, Quake has always had an identity crisis, and each entry did something almost completely different. I mean, I think Quake could have been about anything and would have still been just as influential to the industry, but it's no doubt creatively all over the place. And that kinda works at the same time. Quake feels like if the developers thought that they were never going to make another video game again, so they threw everything they wanted to make in. The game's style and the mix of all of these elements are certainly unique, and I've gotta respect it. Although, we've never seen a Quake game with Lovecraftian, gothic imagery like it again. Excluding the multiplayer boom it had, the impact on FPS games to come, and everything else that Quake achieved, which, by the way, was a ton, does the game still hold up well today? This is Quake, the golden age of id Software. Quake is a fascinating game since it defied all odds and came out on top. As I said before, this game was going to be successful no matter what, and everything mechanically was obviously sound, but people are still fond of Quake's style as well, and that's what I find most interesting. Quake feels not from this world, and is very abstract at times, and that works with the introduction of slipgates. I haven't brushed up on the Quake 1 lore in a long time, so forgive me, but the basic idea of the game is that you go around collecting these 4 runes from different dimensions to stop Shub-Niggurath, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, plans. She is some kind of witch goddess and comes from the Cthulhu mythos. When you boot up Quake, you travel through these slipgates to pick your difficulty level and episode, and this is a huge part of why I think the game can get away with being so thematically diverse, on top of it obviously just being enjoyable. id Software can wave everything off with these slipgates. Oh, it's a different dimension, with this episode having gothic stages as well as tech-based ones. Don't worry about it too much. I also like the novel way that the player chooses their difficulty and episode. It's not just a simple menu, and this immerses you into the world of Quake. I mean, it even says the title loud and proud right here. Over the course of Quake's 4 episodes, I personally believe that the game's design runs a bit thin. Like you'll be seeing the same sort of thing throughout the entire experience. Tech bases, ancient stone castles, waste tunnels, haunted tombs, cultish palaces, etc. With the exception of the early tech bases, most of the levels in Quake don't have too much variety, but the gameplay more than makes up for it. The first thing to note with Quake's gunplay is how you can mouse look all over, and there's more movement options with jumping. There can be video after video about Quake's movements, but it introduced several arena FPS techniques such as bunny hopping, rocket jumping, and more. That's the overly simplified explanation without me being a total expert on the subject. There is also no use key, which is an interesting quirk I had to get used to after playing so much Doom during these past couple of months. The player still needs to hit switches like usual, but you can do that by bumping into them instead of hitting an additional button, which could accelerate the speed of players' runs. There are also specific sequences where you're required to press like 5 of the same sort of switches to activate a door from half a map away, and this is another method that Quake uses to immerse the player deeper into the game. As for the guns themselves, the standout of any id Software game, Quake has your typical collection of weapons on display. The Combat and Super Shotgun, in which the Combat Shotgun replaces the pistol slots entirely. This idea of erasing the pistol was carried over into Doom Eternal, for example, and since the enemies are more bullet spongy than other FPS games, I think this was a good decision on id Software's part with Quake. I believe the pistol would have been entirely useless and wouldn't have put a dent into the stronger enemies in the game. Quake features 2 versions of the nail gun, which is basically the game's equivalent of a machine gun and chain gun from other contemporary shooters. The nail gun is a fun weapon to use and is great for fodder control, as is every rapid-firing machine gun in id Software games. And that's kind of a point I'm making with Quake. The game is a culmination of everything that id Software was working hard on engine-wise since 1991, but in my opinion, it doesn't have a stronger identity as Doom. Quake is cool, don't get me wrong, and I like the gothic atmosphere, the Nine Inch Nails soundtrack, the out-of-this-world 3D graphics. I will always have an appreciation for Quake, and I obviously really like the game, but it doesn't have the it factor like Doom for me. Even though Quake opened up the doors so much with online multiplayer, modding support, the technical innovations, etc., if you strip back all of that, the game is pretty damn great. But I don't know, man, for me it doesn't reach the level of fun as Doom. With all that said, Quake is fucking awesome, and for 1996, this blew the competition out of the water. Even now, the game can be extremely eerie, and the early polygon enemies still have their charm. I feel like most of the enemies made in 90s FPS games hold up and have some sort of charm also. Like, you always appreciate the Pinky Demon, the Shambler, the Pig Cop, even the fat rednecks from Redneck Rampage. Yeah, maybe I'll take a look at that train wreck later. So the nail gun is based off of the Nine Inch Nails band, and this sets it apart from other machine guns at the time. Other Quake weapons include the Thunderbolt, which is basically a last resort weapon for me at least, when I'm on low health and want to kill a tough enemy quickly. Regardless, the game's gunplay is still extremely satisfying, especially when explosives make up a good 75% of the gameplay. The grenade launcher and rocket launcher, when you kill an enemy successfully with them, that might be the best feeling in the world. You just graduated, you might have had a kid, yeah fuck that, because when you destroy any monster in Quake with explosives, you'll say that it's the best day of your life. When you grab the explosive weapons in Quake, they become the most entertaining aspect of the game, and while the other guns are great in their own rights, come on. I think part of the reason blowing up enemies is even more satisfying in Quake than other FPS games at the time is that the monsters also fire explosive projectiles. Take the ogres for example. They have both a melee attack when you get up close and a grenade launcher when you're distant from them. These guys might be the most versatile enemy in the game, and they are probably the best one in Quake, let's be honest. The Shamblers are nicely designed and stem from Lovecraft works. The Knights and Death Knights are unique additions, and they have a real medieval look which we haven't seen too much in id Software games since. The regular soldiers and dogs are standard grunts and they don't really pose that much of a threat. And there's more enemies in Quake, but the ogre is the real standout in my opinion. Though the gunplay and everything is excellent, the bosses let Quake down, and this is the most common complaint with the game even after 20 years. The first episode's boss is this huge demon guy, and to be fair, he looks fucking sadistic. He seems like a badass, but unfortunately, he turns into a pushover really quick when all you have to do is lift this device down and electrocute him a couple of times. That's it. You don't attack him with your gun at all, and everything he attacks with can easily be dodged. Episode 2's boss is barely even a boss, but instead 1 or 2 Vors, depending on the difficulty. Now, the Vor is an enemy that becomes commonplace in the following episodes, and while they do offer up some challenge when mixed in with the other monsters, they aren't that hard as a boss fight. As for episodes 3 and 4, there isn't a boss encounter at all, and the final boss of the game, Shub-Niggurath, is also a pushover. Even though the final boss in Quake is piss easy, I do appreciate how there's a practical reward for beating all of the episodes. Over the course of the game, the episodes that you have beaten get blocked off, and when you complete them all, it grants you access to the final boss level, which I really like actually. That offers a bit of incentive to complete everything, and although the boss is nothing special, the ending text makes you feel like a fucking badass. id Software salutes me. That's awesome. However, all you need to do in order to kill the final boss is to telefrag it, which sounds awesome and is pretty unique for 1996 standards, but she doesn't even attack. Shub-Niggurath stands in place and doesn't throw anything back at you. A disappointing final boss though, which is par for the course with id Software games, doesn't ruin a great game, as Quake is still a classic. Even though I will always have a preference for Doom over Quake, the game continues to kick ass with fan-made mods, and online multiplayer still happening if I recall correctly. The lack of thematic cohesion actually works with Quake, and the mix of science fiction and Lovecraft is kinda interesting to see. The level design, while it doesn't reinvent the wheel and gets a bit tired after the 4 episodes, is still pretty damn good, and offers up some cool experiences. For the first time in an id Software FPS, you could swim, you could jump, and grenades have realistic physics attached to them, and in general, Quake shook the gaming landscape for the rest of time. Aside from the revolutionary qualities of Quake, the game is still a very well designed 90s FPS, and aside from Duke 3D, which is one of my personal favourites, it is the best shooter from 1996. The Quake Mission Packs aren't talked about as much as the expansions for Doom or Wolfenstein. This is interesting because they actually provide the game with brand new content like new weapons, enemies, and alternate fire modes, but they kinda just came and went. The Quake Mission Packs are fascinating little pieces of FPS history, and they are important at least when it comes to the game's modding scene. Quake 1.5, for example, directly rips the laser cannon from the first mission pack and they throw it into the mod. That's the mission pack we'll be taking a look at today, and I do prefer it out of the 2 released. Quake Mission Pack 1 is known as Scourge of Armagon, and features an exclusive antagonist called, well, Armagon. We'll get to him more later and his disappointing boss fights, but let's talk about the positives first. Mission Pack 1 has a hub area like in the base game, but this time it's located in a military HQ. This makes way more sense than starting out in a dark, depressing castle to select your difficulty. I also like that this expansion pack gives you all of the weapons very quickly, and it doesn't waste your time introducing you to the enemies either. Speaking of enemies, the first new monster you will come across is the Centroid, and they shoot out nails at the player. Right off the bat, I've got to say that Armagon's strong suit is not with its new enemies, as the ones that they do include don't change things up very much. At least the Centroids look cool, and they attempt to scatter around on the floor to avoid your gunfire. The other new enemies in Mission Pack 1 consist of the Gremlin and Spike Mine, but none of these are real threats. The Gremlin jumps about and tries to take the player's weapons away, but they're very easy to take care of. The Spike Mines are just floating balls that slowly come towards the player, and if they're close enough, they explode. These are interesting ideas for enemies, don't get me wrong, but they don't reinvent the wheel of Quake's combat loop. The real highlight of Armagon is with the new weapons, in which there are 3 in total. This is a decent amount of exclusive guns, and for the most part, they are very fun to use. The best weapon to use is Mjolnir, as it shoots out powerful bolts of lightning and it deals a ton of damage out to surrounding enemies. When you have enough cells, this hammer is great to bust out and kill a group of bad guys with. Speaking of cell-based weapons, the laser cannon is another new weapon from Mission Pack 1, and it's again very fun to fire. The lasers that shoot out also bounce off the walls, so they do have the opportunity to hit you back. This is an interesting dynamic of the gunplay, and even with that weapon drawback, the laser cannon is still a solid gun. Even though you'll be using it quite a bit during the expansion, the laser gun is not quite a workhorse weapon, and most of the time you'll be taking on levels with the base game guns. This is completely understandable, and while I do want to use the laser gun more often, it seems like all of these FPS expansion weapons aren't mainstays in the roster. Like, nobody really mains the expander from the Duke Nukem 3D Atomic Edition, for example. Speaking of the common Quake weapons, Armagon features a brand new version of the grenade launcher, and it's the worst weapon in the mission pack. The proximity mine launcher fires grenades that can stick onto solid surfaces, and if someone gets close to them, the grenades will explode. I didn't specify enemies in that last sentence because the player can also activate these grenades and then they blow up in your fucking face. I guess you would call this the risk versus reward factor of the mine launcher, but it just makes me not want to use it at all. The laser cannon and Thor's hammer both share cell ammo with the lightning gun, but all of these have clear utility within combats. They also have little to no downsides, which cannot be said for the mine launcher that could get you killed pretty easily. Armagon has cool enemies and for the most part good guns, but what is the level design like in Mission Pack 1? I think that this mission pack does exactly what it needs to do and expand the scope of Quake's level design. Map 1 is called the Pumping Station, and right away it gives the player a clear objective. This level feels more involved compared to just collecting the keys and going through the exit door, and these little scripted events are welcomed by me. The player needs to find a way into the pumping room and then destroy the pumps to end the level. Map 1 is solid, and this level of quality continues all throughout Episode 1. The Lost Mine is probably my favourite level in Armagon's first episode, as the collapsing rocks alter the environment around you, and it's great to see. You can tell that the designers were very ambitious when they made this mission pack, and some of these sequences wind up being even more memorable and impressive than the base game. Episode 1 ends with you flying through this dimensional gateway, and it perfectly sets up Episode 2, which admittedly isn't as interesting as the last episode. Episode 2 gives us gothic castles, spooky cathedrals, and environments that you would associate with Quake most, but the levels just aren't as intricate as the previous ones. That's not to say that Episode 2 doesn't have good levels, because they all share the same quality as Episode 1. The Crypt is a personal standout for me, as I love the zombies coming out of the coffins, and the Indiana Jones-like trap in this red room. Episode 3 features some more well-designed levels, with a handful of awesome gimmicks. A couple of these include the tram ride sequence in the first level, and the section where you need to hit each of the buttons to make parts of a room collapse to make a bridge. Episode 3 also contains the best secret level of the expansion, with it being all located in the Void. Originally, it was just a simple multiplayer map, and that's very evident by the lack of a proper layout, but I find the Void backdrop to be far more interesting than what's found in the other 2 secret levels of the expansion. As a whole, the level design in Mission Pack 1 is consistently pretty damn good, and while the enemies and weapons are more of a mixed bag, they all still make for a solid expansion. Before we discuss the final boss fights, I did want to talk about the underwhelming power-ups. I almost forgot they existed because they don't do a whole lot to shake up the gameplay, but then again, there were some power-ups in the base game that I didn't find useful as well. The best power-up in the entire expansion is the wetsuit, as it more or less acts like the frog suit from Mario 3. It allows you to move around easier and faster when you're underwater, and it also prevents you from drowning, similar to the biosuit from the base game. The wetsuit is a solid alternative to the biosuit, and I found this to be the most useful power-up in my playthrough. The other two power-ups are not as effective, with me finding no real use for the empathy shield, and the Horn of Conjuring also being a mixed bag. The Horn of Conjuring, as the title implies, conjures up a monster to help you out in battle. This sounds like a cool idea, but sometimes the enemy that spawns in is entirely useless. You sometimes get the Shambler, which is fantastic, but then you also sometimes get a dog. This power-up is great in theory, but I found it ultimately to be a huge inconvenience.
Yeah, because she knows all about an inconvenience. And she knows all about that.
And quit school the year after.
Yeah, when you give birth to your uncle's baby in 6th grade in Covington, wherever, Louisiana, it's an inconvenience.
That being said, the final boss is obviously Armagon, and he is just your typical 90s first-person shooter boss fights. You circle strafe around his attacks, you shoot him a bunch, and you win the game. Lackluster boss fight aside, Mission Pack 1 is a very well-crafted expansion for Quake, and if you want good level design coupled with some fun weapons to try out, then play this game. I appreciate how the designers took some risks and pushed the idea of what a Quake level could be at the time. There are more gimmicks and scripted sequences that will keep the player interested, and some of these set pieces are arguably more engaging than the base game's levels. This mission pack wasn't the end though, and a month later, Dissolution of Eternity was released. For right now, however, the minions of Quake have once again fallen before your mighty hand. The second Quake Mission Pack was released a few weeks after Scourge of Armagon, and it was created by an entirely different studio. Quake Dissolution of Eternity was developed by Rogue Entertainment, while Mission Pack 1 was developed by Hypnotic Software, and I've got to say that these expansions are the direct opposites of each other. Mission Pack 1 uses familiar locations from the original game, tech bases, gothic castles, etc. However, Armagon updates these reused locations by adding all sorts of gimmicks and unique set pieces in them. The earthquakes found in the Lost Mine level is the prime example of this. Mission Pack 2 on the other hand has distinct Egyptian and Roman themed locations that aren't found in the base game at all, but the level design itself is very standard. Mission Pack 1 features a good selection of brand new weapons, but kinda skims out on adding new enemies. As you could probably guess, Mission Pack 2 provides a good amount of new enemies, but there are no new weapons to play with. Mission Packs 1 and 2 are completely different from one another, and at least I prefer the first Mission Pack over the second. Today I'm here to review Dissolution of Eternity and talk about why I think it's weaker than Armagon. Instead of having 3 episodes like in the first Mission Pack, Eternity is split up into 2 episodes for the player to go through. There are more levels per episode in Mission Pack 2, but I think having maps cut up into more episodes gives the expansions better pacing. Eternity also features a central hub level, and it harkens back to the base game starting area with a dark medieval interior. Even though roaming around the command headquarters from Mission Pack 1 makes more sense from an in-universe perspective, I love how the starting area looks in Eternity. The giant Quake logo that's imprinted on the ceiling is an amazing touch as well, and I honestly prefer it to the word Quake just being plastered on the wall like in the base game. If you want to bump up the difficulty, I say go straight to Nightmare, which can be done if you shoot these hidden switches. Getting across the bridge to travel through the hard portal is such a pain in the ass, because the level starts shaking and your movement is compromised. Don't get me wrong, I find it entertaining that it's hard going through the hard difficulty mode, but I just wish that the bridge wasn't so narrow to where I fall off all the fucking time. Episode 1 of this expansion is fairly run-of-the-mill, and the only real highlight is just seeing some of the new enemies for the first time. The Electric Eel is the new water-based monster in Mission Pack 2, and even though they don't change up the gameplay that much, I do like their inclusion. The fish that are found in the base game gnaw at your fucking face, but they don't have any other unique attack patterns or AI. This is why the Electric Eel is a small, simple, but effective addition to the enemy lineup. Most of the new bad guys that show up early on in episode 1 are retooled versions of monsters from the base game. Take the Phantom Swordsman as another example, and how it's basically an invisible version of the Knight. I mean, to be fair, it's just a fucking floating sword, but you get my point. The Hellspawn is a more powerful variant of the original Spawn, and out of all Quake enemies, why would they choose the most annoying one to beef up? Aside from the green coloring, the Hellspawn can also duplicate itself, and your best bet is to kill it as fast as possible. Thankfully, they don't show up too much in the expansion, and there's only a couple of levels where they actually make an appearance. The Wrath is a brand new enemy in Mission Pack 2 with a completely unique design and everything. They remind me of the Scrags from the base game with how they fly about in the air, but the Wrath is much more dangerous. I like how they look, they add some diversity to the combat loop, and they're a solid addition. Speaking of which, the Guardians and Statues are two more new exclusive enemies. While they aren't hard to kill in the slightest, and they are direct reskins of the Knight and Death Knights, they look cool, and it's great seeing the statues come alive after seeing them stand still earlier in the level. There are even some mini-bosses in Mission Pack 2 that kinda fall in the same vein as the Wraths, Guardians, and strangely enough, the Episode 1 boss. Similar to almost every other Quake enemy, they are quite bullet spongy and have decent designs, but that's about it. There is one other new monster in the expansion, and that is the multi-grenade ogre. I refrained from talking about him until I reached the end of the roster, because he is tied to the new modified weapon ammo types that Mission Pack 2 has to offer. As you could guess from the title, this ogre fires multi-grenades from its gun, and the player can also acquire this new ammo type. The Nail Gun, Super Nail Gun, Grenade Launcher, Rocket Launcher, and Thunderbolt all have alternate ammo types, and you can find these in levels, just as you would with the normal ammo pickups. The most underwhelming new ammo type is the Lava Nails for both versions of the Nail Gun. Apparently, these lava nails deal 30% more damage to all of the enemies except for the Lava Man mini-boss, which makes sense, but I didn't recognize that much of a difference to make using them worthwhile. Sure, this new ammo type is more powerful, but it never felt like a game changer when I picked any of it up. At least when you select the lava nails though, your weapon looks heated up, and it almost looks like something out of Brutal Legend. The multi-grenade ammo type makes it so that your grenades explode into a group of little clusters that also blow up. This is an effective way to clear out a group of fodder enemies, but I didn't use this alternate fire mode a lot. I do appreciate how the multi-grenades change up the gun's properties and how it works slightly, instead of just making the grenades more powerful like the lava nails. The multi-rockets is an alternate ammo type for the rocket launcher of course, and it fires one rocket initially but then splits up into 4 deadly ones. This is such a great weapon to use on the strongest enemies, and you get a decent amount of ammo for it, which makes it a workhorse for the mini-bosses and other big enemies. The Plasma Cell is the final new fire mode in the expansion, and I didn't find much utility in it. The Thunderbolt is an effective weapon as it is, and I think the Hammer and Laser Cannon from Mission Pack 1 do a better job of being cell-based weapon alternatives. Speaking of which, if you compare the new weapons from Armagon to the new ammo types from Eternity, then there's really no contest on which is better. The alternate ammo pickups are pretty disappointing when you go from Mission Pack 1 to Mission Pack 2, and I wish that there was at least one brand new weapon. At least Mission Pack 2 has the anti-gravity belt, which lowers the player's gravity, allows them to jump higher, and also lower to the ground more gracefully. I think this is an awesome new power-up, and it harkens back to the secret level in Quake Episode 1. That's what I appreciate about both of these expansion packs, how they incorporated previous ideas for Quake and brought them into the game again. Now obviously the low gravity concept was put into the game with the secret level, but there are other unused elements and concepts from Quake's development that both Rogue Entertainment and Hypnotic Software threw into their expansions. Case in point, there was initially going to be a dragon in Quake, and they even put up a screenshot with one of them from the test build. But no dragon found its way into the actual game. The final boss of Mission Pack 2 is a dragon, and in my opinion, it looks pretty badass flying around the place. The dragon's fireballs can be deadly if they come into contact with the player, and even though it's not the most dynamic boss in the world, there is some pleasure you get by seeing a dragon in Quake if you know its development history. Also, the idea of using a magical hammer to fight with and the game having more fantasy elements was being kicked around. And while the game does have fantasy locations and enemies, it's a far cry from what was being planned initially. Mission Pack 1 brings the hammer weapon back, and Mission Pack 2 has more magic-based enemies like the Wraths and Phantom Swordsmen. That all being said, the level design in Mission Pack 2 is lacking compared to the base game, and even the first Mission Pack. Like I talked about before, Episode 1 is pretty stock standard, and that surprised me considering that the brand new locations were heavily advertised on the back of the box. The first episode doesn't showcase any of the Egyptian or Roman aesthetics, and every level that makes up Episode 1 are just your generic Quake maps. That's not a bad thing inherently, and that could have worked if there were unique gimmicks on offer like in Mission Pack 1. If you remember, Scourge of Armagon used similar tech base and medieval settings, but the overall level design shined through because it brought different set pieces to the table. In the first half of Mission Pack 2, there isn't any, and you get pretty standard Quake levels in Episode 1. At least the second episode gets right down to it, and the player gets to explore Egyptian pyramids, Roman forums, and Mesoamerican temples. The actual level design is par for the course, but it was fun exploring these brand new environments that we never got to see in the base game. These levels expand the idea of what a Quake 1 map could look like back in 1997, and that's always a good thing. My overall thoughts on Mission Pack 2 swing slightly towards negative and positive, and that's mostly due to me not loving the map design. I just believe that Mission Pack 1 has more engaging levels with more interesting things to do. While Mission Pack 2 has the unique level themes, it takes way too long to actually get to those locations in my opinion. But maybe I'm just an impatient twat, that's always possible as well. On the subject of comparing the two expansions, Mission Pack 2 lacks any brand new weapons, and although the focus of the Mission Pack was to add a lot of enemies instead, half of the new roster are repurposed and reskinned versions of enemies from the base game. I'm not saying that Mission Pack 2 is horrible or anything, because at the end of the day you're still playing Quake, but I didn't enjoy my time as much as I wanted to. However, I think it's good that we have two very different expansions for the original game, and if you prefer Mission Pack 2 over Mission Pack 1, that's totally cool and I respect that. With that in mind, your consciousness fades as you realize you have halted Quake's plans for the Dissolution of Eternity. Whatever the fuck that means.